Secretary of Defense ignored a deaf girl at the table until a female soldier spoke in sign language. The banquet hall shimmered with chandeliers and laughter, but beneath the golden light sat a child no one seemed to notice. The Secretary of Defense commanded every glance, every smile, every nod of approval. Yet at the far end of the table, a 10-year-old girl sat in silence, her braid neat, her eyes searching for recognition. She raised her hands, forming signs, her only language. No one responded. No one cared. Even the secretary looked away, his smirk confirming what the others had silently agreed. She did not matter, but one soldier noticed. Captain Emily Ward, young and disciplined, felt her chest tighten as she watched the girl's silent plea. Memories stirred, promises made long ago to never ignore the unheard. Emily's jaw clenched. In that moment, she faced a choice: stay seated and safe, or rise and defy the most powerful man in the room. If you want to see stories of courage that expose the truth hidden behind silence, subscribe now, leave a like, and share your thoughts below. What happened next shattered the entire hall. A soldier's hands, moving gently in the air, would become the most powerful act of defiance the secretary had ever faced. The banquet hall gleamed with chandeliers that cast golden light over the long oak table, where polished silverware and crystal glasses reflected a show of wealth and power. At the head sat Secretary of Defense Richard Kane, his presence commanding the room before he had even spoken a word. Laughter rippled among the guests at his slightest gesture, and every eye seemed eager to catch his approval. Yet, at the far side of the table, unnoticed by most, sat a girl of 10, her braid neatly tied, her hands resting nervously on her lap. She was deaf, and in that silence, her world collided with theirs. Anna Thompson's eyes darted around the table, searching for someone willing to notice her. She tugged gently at her napkin, trying to smile, but the indifference surrounding her was suffocating. She lifted her fingers and began forming small signs, words only she seemed to understand. A few nearby guests glanced her way, puzzled, then quickly looked back toward Kane, unwilling to break the rhythm of the evening. Their indifference echoed louder than any insult. It was as if her presence was an inconvenience, something best left ignored. Kane noticed her movement, but chose not to acknowledge it. With a faint smirk, he raised his glass, drawing everyone's attention back to him. To power, to order, he said, his voice firm, calculated, filling the room like command. Glasses clinked in unison, sealing the toast, while the girl lowered her hands, cheeks burning red. She tried to shift in her seat, but the chair felt heavier, the distance between her and the others growing like an invisible wall. Captain Emily Ward, seated halfway down the table, noticed. The young soldier, no older than her late 20s, had been quiet throughout the evening, her posture rigid with discipline, but her eyes caught every flicker of discomfort, every suppressed sigh. And now they caught Anna's silent plea. Emily's chest tightened. She had seen soldiers under fire look braver than this little girl trying to be seen at a dinner table. Something inside her stirred, a quiet conflict between duty to remain invisible and a compulsion to act. The dinner pressed on, conversations flowing about military budgets, strategic alliances, and future campaigns. Kane's laughter punctuated the air, and his authority loomed over every word. But Emily's attention remained fixed on the girl. She watched Anna's small hands moving under the tablecloth, tracing invisible words, practicing the language of her silence. A pang of recognition hit Emily. She knew those signs. She had learned them years ago, out of compassion for a brother-in-arms who had lost his hearing. Now that knowledge returned like a burden and a gift. Anna's gaze shifted again toward Kane, then down to her plate. The secretary's deliberate disregard had cut deeper than any cruel remark. She felt herself shrinking, becoming invisible in the grand spectacle of polished uniforms and empty toasts. Emily clenched her jaw. Every second of silence weighed heavier. Every smirk from Kane and the guests burned hotter. The girl's isolation was no accident. It was a choice. And choices, Emily knew, could be confronted. Still, hesitation held her down. To rise in this setting meant breaking protocol, risking her future, perhaps even her career. Soldiers were not meant to overshadow their superiors, let alone challenge them. Emily's hands curled into fists under the table, her mind torn between obedience and conscience. She glanced once more at Anna, whose eyes shimmered with unspoken questions no one dared to answer. The girl's pain felt louder than the secretary's voice. The hall echoed with speeches about strength and discipline, yet at that very moment the truest test of strength sat ignored in plain sight. Emily could feel it, the contradiction that gnawed at her, loyalty to authority versus loyalty to justice. Every story she had ever heard of soldiers who acted against silence played back in her mind, warning and encouraging her all at once. And for the first time that evening, her heart pounded louder than the applause. As Kane leaned forward to dominate another conversation, Anna let out a quiet sigh, her fingers twitching into a sign for a loan. No one noticed, except Emily. Their eyes locked for the briefest second, and Emily felt a surge of resolve ripple through her. The question was no longer if she would act, but when, and as the tension thickened in the room, the stage was set for the first fracture in the secretary's control. Emily tried to steady her breath as the clatter of silverware and low hum of conversation filled the hall. Her uniform felt tighter than ever, every button pressing against her chest like a reminder of duty. She glanced toward Kane, who leaned back in his chair, confident and untouchable. Every movement from him radiated authority, but to Emily it looked more like arrogance. And then her gaze drifted again to Anna, the small figure at the edge of the table. The girl traced signs across her lap, words no one cared to see. Emily recognized them, but the fear of what acknowledging them would mean kept her silent. The memory of a comrade flashed in her mind, a fellow soldier who had lost his hearing after an explosion. Emily had once promised herself that if she ever saw someone isolated by silence again, she wouldn't turn away. That vow burned inside her now. But this was not a battlefield. It was a banquet hall ruled by politics. To break the silence here meant challenging the secretary himself. Her hand hovered near her glass of water, trembling slightly. Every instinct told her to stay still. Every beat of her heart told her to rise. Kane's voice boomed again, dominating the conversation. "Power must be seen, not whispered," he said, smirking as guests nodded obediently. Emily caught the flicker of Anna's eyes. Sad, heavy, desperate. The girl tapped her fork lightly on the plate, then shaped the sign for Y with her small fingers. Emily's throat tightened. She wanted to answer, but how could she in front of the entire hall? For a soldier, silence was sometimes survival. But for Anna, silence was a prison. The girl's small hand faltered, and she pushed her plate away. She shifted in her chair, trying to slide off, as if escaping would spare her further humiliation. A chair leg scraped against the marble floor, catching the attention of a few guests. Kane shot a glance, sharp and dismissive, then returned to his wine as if nothing had happened. That single look told everyone, ignore her. Emily's pulse quickened. She knew that ignoring this moment would mean betraying herself. Yet hesitation clawed at her. Her career had barely begun. Decorated officers like Kane held her future in their hands. What if standing up meant being dismissed, ridiculed, cast out of the very institution she had sworn to serve? Her mind raced with visions of disciplinary hearings, of accusations of insubordination. But then she saw Anna's shoulders slump and her tiny hands curl into fists. The girl was fighting tears, and no one cared. Emily's doubts wavered. The guests carried on, raising glasses, offering hollow laughter. But Emily felt her world narrow to just two people. Kane and Anna. One represented everything she feared, the other everything she could not ignore. She felt the heat rising in her chest, the war between obedience and justice tearing her apart. Kane's laughter thundered across the table, but it no longer drowned out Anna's silence. For Emily, that silence screamed louder than any command. Her fingers brushed the edge of her sleeve, almost instinctively. She thought of the sign she still remembered, the way her hands could speak where words failed. It wasn't just communication. It was defiance, a bridge across worlds no one else dared to cross. She bit her lip, pulse racing. If she moved now, she would challenge not just Kane, but the entire order of the room. She felt the eyes of her peers. Even if they weren't looking at her yet, she knew they would. Anna's hand trembled as she shaped another word, this time alone. Emily swallowed hard. It was unbearable. That simple word cut sharper than Kane's authority ever could. For Emily, the choice had crystallized. Either she stayed in her seat and became one more shadow in the room, or she stood and rewrote the silence. Her chair creaked as she shifted, but she stopped herself halfway, caught between fear and resolve. The room was seconds away from a fracture, and she knew she was the one who would cause it. The sound of Kane's laughter rolled over the table like command, forcing the others to laugh along. But it wasn't joy. It was obedience dressed as amusement. Emily sat frozen, her chest tight, her fingers twitching against the tablecloth. Her chair felt like a prison cell, holding her in place while injustice paraded freely. Anna stared at her plate, her braids slipping over one shoulder as her small hands folded in defeat. Emily could almost hear the weight of silence crushing the girl, and in that silence she found her breaking point. Kane leaned forward, his voice dripping with mockery. "She doesn't understand a thing," he said, gesturing faintly toward Anna, as if she were less than human. A few guests chuckled nervously, their eyes darting away to avoid guilt. That laugh cut Emily like a blade. She had endured enough commands, humiliation, endless rules. But this was not discipline, it was cruelty. The decision snapped inside her like the crack of a rifle. She would not stay seated. Her chair scraped back against the marble floor, the sudden sound slicing through the hum of conversation. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Glasses paused in the air. All eyes turned toward her, confusion flickering across the guests' faces. Emily rose slowly, every movement deliberate, her uniform catching the chandelier's light. Kane's smirk stiffened. For the first time that night, he was not in control. She could feel the power shift in the silence that followed. Emily didn't speak. Her throat was dry, her breath steady but heavy with resolve. Instead, she lifted her hands, palms trembling slightly, and let them rise into the air. A ripple of disbelief swept the table. Some whispered, others frowned, unsure what they were about to witness. Kane narrowed his eyes, the beginnings of a command on his lips. But before he could speak, Emily began to move her hands. The first sign was slow, careful. "Hello." Anna's head snapped up, her eyes wide as if a door had opened in front of her. The child's lips parted, and for the first time that evening she smiled, a small, fragile curve that pierced the atmosphere like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Murmurs rose from the guests, confusion mixing with awe. Kane shifted uncomfortably, but his voice caught in his throat. Emily continued, her hands flowing more confidently now. "You are not alone." The girl's shoulders straightened, her fingers twitching in recognition. She replied shakily, her signs imperfect but full of longing. "You see me." The entire room watched as if frozen, their disbelief turned into something deeper. Respect, shame, maybe even admiration. The balance of the evening had shifted entirely, and Kane's authority was slipping with every gesture Emily made. The silence in the hall was no longer oppressive. It was electric. Guests leaned in, eyes locked on exchange between soldier and child. Kane clenched his jaw, his hands tightening around the stem of his glass, until it threatened to crack. He had been outmaneuvered, without a single word spoken aloud. Emily's defiance wasn't loud or violent. It was gentle, human, devastating. And that was what made it impossible to challenge. Anna's hands formed another sign, her lips trembling. "Thank you." Emily felt a swell of warmth and sorrow all at once, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had broken the silence, and with it, the stranglehold of authority at the table. The hall held its breath, balanced between outrage and awe. The question was no longer what Emily had done. It was how everyone else would respond. The hall seemed suspended in time, the weight of silence pressing on every guest as Emily's hands moved through the air. Kane's authority, once untouchable, felt fragile in the face of her defiance. Anna's eyes glowed with recognition, her small fingers hesitating before returning the gesture. The connection was instant, pure, undeniable. It was as though Emily had reached across an abyss that no one else dared to cross, and pulled the child back into the light. The guests exchanged glances, unsure if they were witnessing insubordination or something far greater. Kane cleared his throat, a sharp sound that tried to reassert control. "Captain," he began, his tone laced with warning, "this is not the place." But the words died on his lips as Anna signed something simple yet profound. I matter. The innocence and defiance combined in that single phrase struck harder than any speech. A murmur rippled across the table, some guests shifting uncomfortably, others leaning forward, unable to look away. Kane's voice, for once, was powerless. Emily steadied her breath, letting her hand speak louder than Kane's authority. She matters. She signed back toward Anna, but the message resonated with everyone watching. The truth hung in the air, undeniable, and it cracked the facade of the evening. Kane's jaw tightened as he realized the narrative had slipped from his grasp. Emily wasn't just speaking to Anna anymore. She was exposing the emptiness of his power. The guests began to react in whispers. Some frowned, fearing the fallout of such defiance, while others softened, their eyes reflecting a shame they hadn't expected to feel. One general shifted uncomfortably in his seat, as though realizing his medals had never carried the weight of this soldier's courage. Kane scanned the room, but instead of obedience he saw hesitation. That hesitation was deadly. It meant his control was breaking. Anna's hands fluttered nervously before forming another phrase. They see me now. Her small smile trembled but carried a strength that filled the room. Emily's eyes watered, though she forced herself to remain steady. She had not planned this, had not sought attention, but the truth was undeniable. What had begun as a child's silent cry had become a mirror, reflecting the arrogance and indifference of power. Kane slammed his glass down, the sharp crack startling the room. "Enough!" he barked, but even his voice lacked its usual weight. The guests didn't laugh or nod this time. Instead, they sat frozen, torn between fear of him and the undeniable truth they had just seen. The silence after his outburst was not obedience. It was rejection. His authority had been shattered, not by rebellion, but by compassion. Emily stood firm, her hands lowering slowly, her gaze still on Anna. She had said enough without words. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, charged, alive. Anna's head lifted high, her smile breaking through the years of exclusion. The guests could feel it. Something irreversible had just happened. Kane's reign of arrogance had cracked, and the fracture was visible to all. For the first time in the evening, Kane looked small. His shoulders slumped ever so slightly, his eyes darting across the hall for validation and finding none. He had been defeated not by rank or command, but by a soldier's choice to speak in the only language that mattered. The hall was waiting, balanced on the edge of a response. And the next move would decide whether Kane could recover, or whether Emily's truth had already rewritten everything. The hall remained suspended in stillness, the air thick with the weight of what had just unfolded. Emily kept her eyes on Anna, refusing to flinch under Kane's glare. The girl, once invisible at the table, now sat upright, her face radiant with newfound confidence. She raised her hands and signed again, slowly, deliberately, "I am here." The gesture struck deeper than any command Kane could issue. For the first time, the guests were no longer watching him. They were watching her. A ripple moved through the room. Some of the guests shifted uncomfortably, their loyalty to authority colliding with the undeniable truth they had just witnessed. One senator cleared his throat, as if to speak, but no words came. The silence was louder than any protest. Kane tried to gather himself, sitting taller, but his face betrayed the unease in his heart. He had lost control, not because he was opposed, but because he had been ignored. Emily exhaled slowly, her pulse still racing. She had broken protocol, risked her career, but the sight of Anna smiling was enough to quiet every fear. Her hands trembled as she lowered them to her side, but her stance was steady. She had not just offended a child. She had redefined what leadership meant in that room. Kane's authority had rested on fear. Hers rested on compassion. The contrast was undeniable. Anna leaned closer to Emily, whispering her first words of the evening in the smallest voice, barely audible. "Thank you." It was imperfect, strained, but it carried more power than Kane's toast had earlier. The guests froze again, realizing the weight of the moment. A child, previously dismissed, had spoken, truly spoken, for the first time that night. The silence that followed was reverent, not oppressive. Kane's jaw tightened. He slammed his palm against the table, but the sound rang hollow. No one flinched this time. The audience of generals, senators, and officials no longer reflected his dominance back at him. Instead, they remained transfixed on the unlikely pair, the soldier and the child. Cain's fury faltered as he realized the truth. His power had been dismantled by something he could neither mock nor silence. Emily held her ground. She didn't gloat, didn't smile in victory. Her silence was deliberate, a statement louder than any speech she could give. Her gaze lingered on Anna, a silent promise that she would never again be ignored. The room understood this wasn't insubordination, it was humanity, and humanity had won. The applause that might come never arrived, not because they disapproved, but because the silence itself was the applause. Anna lifted her hands one final time, signing the words, "You see me now." Emily answered with steady hands. Always. The guests felt the exchange reverberate inside them, a truth too profound to dismiss. It wasn't just the girl who had been seen. It was everyone's own complicity laid bare. The hall carried the weight of shame and the chance of redemption all at once. Cain sat back, his face pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time, he seemed small, overshadowed by a soldier whose name he had never spoken and a girl he had chosen to ignore. The tables had turned, not through violence or rebellion, but through silence given voice. He could no longer pretend that authority was enough. His defeat was written in the eyes of everyone present. As the evening closed, Emily returned to her seat slowly, her heart pounding but steady. Anna leaned against her, safe, visible, seen. The hall remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of indifference. It was a silence of awe. And in that quiet, the truth resonated. Sometimes the most powerful words are the ones spoken without sound.